speaker this morning is Tiffany Green. Dr. Green is a PhD trained economist, a professor at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, an award-winning speaker who has been a member of Toastmasters International for a decade. She also serves as a speaker coach for TEDx and various speech competitions. Tiffany is also a humanist celebrant who is legally authorized to perform weddings anywhere in the United States. Additional services include baby naming, adoption, transgender naming ceremonies, and other celebrations of life. In order to provide clients with the best experience possible, she is currently enrolled in the Master Celebrant Certificate Program offered by the Celebrant Academy. Tiffany's education and experiences have made her a firm believer that one's ceremony should reflect their story and personal journey. Please give Tiffany Green a round of applause.
Thank you so much. I'm hoping everybody can hear me today since I have people both in front of me on the screen and those of you there in Chicago. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay, great. It is a pleasure and an honor to be asked to open up the Women of Color Beyond Belief Conference, to be in community with other women of color that are secular and our accomplices is a joy for me. And I am completely honored and grateful to Mandisa for asking me to be here today. In preparing for this talk, I had the privilege of revisiting the origin story of the reproductive justice movement, as described by one of its founders, Tony Leonard. The year was 1994, and 12 Black women were gathered at a conference. I think it was actually in Chicago, like this one, sponsored by the Miss Foundation and the Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance. At the time, the Clinton administration was advocating for healthcare reform. Some of you may remember, but the Black women in attendance believed that these proposed reforms were not enough, and they needed to cover all reproductive health services, including abortion. And there was a coalition of women's health advocates there, but the Black women, as usual, we said that's not enough. And they demanded that this healthcare bill cover abortion, contraceptives, healthcare for women of color and their families that were disproportionately affected by things like intimate partner violence, HIV/AIDS, and sex and sexuality, and do it in an affordable way. So the conversations we're having now, Black women and other women of color have always led. And over subsequent months, this idea of reproductive justice became coming into being. They started to talk about the theoretical and practical implications. And they realized that the language and theorizing around reproductive rights, this idea of having access to abortion or not having access to abortion, simply was not enough. And for things to change, there had to be a fundamental shift in the balance of power towards those who were marginalized. And that is why reproductive justice came into being. Reproductive rights plus social justice makes reproductive justice. And this whole slide here shows an ad that 836 Black women took out in the Washington Post, including then future Congresswoman Maxine Waters, our auntie, Eleanor Holmes Milton, and more. And in this document, they demanded healthcare. They demanded universal access to affordable healthcare and protection from discrimination. And 3 years later, Sister Song was born, a coalition of 16 women of color-led organizations, anchored by 4 national organizations, representing Black and/or Latina, Asian, and Native American Indigenous organizations. And the tenets of reproductive justice are powerful. They are the right not to have children, the right to have children under the conditions that we choose, and 3, the right to parent the children that we have in safe environments. Now, the founders were clear. This applies to everyone who can have children and parent them, which of course includes our trans and non-binary siblings. And I don't know about you, but I can't think of any more humanist ideas or conceptions than that. But in 2021, it feels like we're further from these goals than we ever have been. And even though I can't think of any more pressing issue for our secular organizations to tackle, they have chosen not to do so, pretending as if social justice and concepts of intersectionality, and by extension, reproductive justice, they're somehow beneath us, as if they're less grounded in evidence, that they're not scientific. But I'll argue today that we will never, ever, ever get it right. And we will never thrive if we don't center the concerns of the most vulnerable and use evidence as our guiding star. And to be frank, recognize the powerful and transformative leadership of women of color in this movement. Today, I'll give a brief overview of racial ethnic disparities in reproductive health that drove and continue to motivate the need for a reproductive justice movement. I'll talk about why the exclusion of intersectional analyses and reproductive justice in the secular movement are problematic from a scientific and evidence-based perspective, and provide receipts, because I don't do anything without receipts. And then I'll provide examples of the way that we in the secular community can lead in this space rather than shy away from it. I want to say before I talk about some of these racial disparities in reproductive health, that it's critical to acknowledge that trans men and non-binary individuals are part of this community. But one of the limitations of this science is that we don't capture this population in the data. So please put a bracket on that as we move forward, and know that many of these disparities also likely apply to those groups as well. So let's talk about racial ethnic disparities in reproductive health. So when we talk about reproductive health, we often think about birth outcomes, but a really critical component of reproductive health and reproductive justice, in fact, is the ability to get pregnant if you want to. And we know that Black women report being twice as likely to have trouble getting pregnant compared to white women. We have higher miscarriage rates, and we're less likely to access and be able to succeed in access to reproductive health care. And although thinking about mistimed pregnancy or unwanted pregnancy is a little bit problematic, we know that on most dimensions, women of color are more likely to report having a mistimed or unwanted pregnancy. Preconception, we're more likely to have higher rates of chronic disease. We are also more likely to have pregnancy complications such as preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, etc. And as you have heard lots about today, if you've been listening to the news, Black women are most likely to die from pregnancy-related complications. And although the data is more sparse on Native American women, they have marginally better maternal mortality rates than we do. So essentially, Black and Indigenous women are far more likely to die as a result of pregnancy-related complications. And you can see here, this is reflected in maternal morbidity. Here's some data from Wisconsin, where I live, and you can see that Native and Black women in my state have some of the worst incidents of maternal morbidity. And we also experience worse postpartum outcomes. So higher rates of morbidity, mortality, and even depression. For example, my work and work of others shows that Black and Asian women experience worse postpartum health compared to white women. And then COVID. So you might say, well, what does COVID have to do with reproductive justice? Well, I'll tell you in a minute. But what I can say is that we see much higher, disproportionately higher rates of COVID particularly among Hispanic Latino populations compared to white populations. Native Americans are 3.5 times more likely to be hospitalized and over twice as likely to die. And Black people and Hispanic people are also about twice as likely to die relative to non-Hispanic whites. And more importantly, when we talk about reproductive justice, we have to be concerned with raising our children in safety. We know that over three quarters of the children that have contracted COVID are Hispanic and or Black, and they are also more likely to have lost a parent as a result of COVID. So this very pandemic is a reproductive justice issue because it makes it more difficult to raise our children in safety. And so why do we see these things? And why is the secular movement not addressing them? I'll talk about that a little bit now. This is a little snapshot from the Center for Inquiry. And this is not to pick on the Center for Inquiry. I actually was first trained as a secular celebrant with CFI. And believe me, I believe in everything up here. So let's take homeopathy. I have to be really honest with y'all. I love a scam. Does anybody watch Scam Goddess or listen to Scam Goddess on the radio? I love that. I love it. I'm part of the congregation. And homeopathy is a huge scam. I totally agree with them. You know, I really wish that Steve Harvey was right about our lack of moral barometers, because I would be scamming everybody. Sugar and water, right? And vaccines. Vaccines are a huge issue. We're seeing low vaccination rates, and it's causing so much overtaxing of our hospital systems. As a mother of 2 children too young to be vaccinated, I feel like I'm playing Russian roulette every day. And frankly, I'm really angry that I can't be here with y'all today in person because I have unvaccinated children and they are not protected because we are, as a collective, are not highly vaccinated. And then there's charter schools. I agree with CFI about charter schools. I've attended public schools since 6th grade. Middle school, high school, college, grad school, postdocs, and even my 2 faculty positions. I'm a public school baby. And our tax dollars should not be going to religious schools or religious indoctrination rather than our drastically underfunded schools. So here's the problem. If we don't consider the social and political context in which these things are occurring, we miss so much and we don't get it right. For example, let's look at vaccinations. So one of the key we can see here, this is a little bit of a problematic chart because it looks at the total population vaccinated rather than total eligible population. But here you can see that there are some significant racial ethnic disparities in vaccination uptake, which of course has implications for getting sick and dying from COVID. But one of the key factors in vaccinations is having a medical provider, and particularly having a medical provider that you trust. And what did these women demand at the beginning when they talked about healthcare reform and reproductive justice? They demanded universal coverage and equal access to affordable healthcare services. And the reason that we are seeing these vaccination disparities is largely due to that lack of access to care. And where does that come from? It comes from the fact that we have a racialized occupational structure in the United States. There has been, when we talk about how race is distributed across occupations, we know that Black and Brown people are more likely to be essential workers. And many of these populations are not places that have healthcare coverage. And you would say, well, some people would say in the secular movement, that's an individual choice. And I would say incorrect, right? This is a form of institutional discrimination. So people of color were much more likely, especially Black people, were more likely to be excluded from union bargains, collective bargaining. And those are the laws and the policies and procedures that allowed people to have sick coverage, that allowed them to have time off of work. And these are the things that are linked to being able to get a vaccine, be able to stay at home and recover from vaccines, et cetera, right? So all of those things matter. Similarly, this is a not so nice comment from our Chief Justice in the state of Wisconsin that talked about the outbreaks of COVID in meatpacking plants in Brown County. She said these outbreaks were due to the meatpacking though. That's where Brown County got the flare. It wasn't regular folks. And what the context here is that these not regular folks were immigrants. They were generally brown immigrants in factories that were not operating in safe workplace conditions, and such exposed these people to COVID. So when we talk about vaccines, when we talk about healthcare, we cannot have this conversation with talking about how occupations are racialized in the US and how that distributes access to care. And that is what reproductive justice realized and advocated for from the very beginning. And then you might say, oh, well, This is why we need to pass universal health care. Well, here's the problem. Again, if we don't think about race, that we miss the whole story. You might say, well, if we pass the ACA, at least people above us, below a certain point of the poverty line will be covered. Well, what I would tell you is that here are differences in support for the ACA by race ethnicity. And you can see that although support is highest among Black, non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic Americans, and lowest among white Americans, evidence from the political sciences literature says, look, the passage of the ACA isn't dependent on everybody's support. It's dependent on the proportion of white people that support the ACA in a state. And when white support is low and Black support is higher, that really decreases the probability that that Medicaid expansion is going to occur. So again, we cannot talk about vaccinations. We cannot talk about access to care without talking about race and racism. Similarly, the reproductive justice movement demanded that we have comprehensive access to care. And why is this important? It's important because the laws and policies that we have structure our health and well-being. For example, we know that states like mine in Wisconsin stifle access to comprehensive reproductive care, including abortion. And you say, well, why does that matter? We know that this variation in access to abortion across states adversely affects pregnant people, and particularly Black pregnant people. So when we talk about, again, making sure we have comprehensive access to care, all that is linked to vaccination. And then the one about homeopathy. Now, again, I don't believe in homeopathy. I think after about 2,000 studies showing that it probably doesn't work, I think we're pretty safe. But when you talk about homeopathy as merely myth busting, you miss the fact that the use of alternative medicine is very much linked to medical mistrust. And Black Americans in particular, racial discrimination is linked to the use of alternative medicine. So we have studies that demonstrate that, right? And so we cannot talk about homeopathy. We cannot talk about alternative medicine without talking about medical mistrust. And you see here, people talk about Tuskegee a lot in the Tuskegee experiment. Well, one of the horrors of Tuskegee was not people injecting Black men with syphilis. It was the fact that they had syphilis and they allowed it to progress without giving them treatment when treatment occurred. And it's even worse because the people in charge of the experiment told doctors in the area not to treat the Black men, even when they found that something was wrong, and they spread congenital syphilis not only to their partners and their children. So again, this is all part of reproductive justice. Here you can see with medical neglect, we can talk about the questionable hysterectomies of immigrants that were detained in Georgia. We know that doctors removed the uteruses of a number of women and where it was not medically indicated. So you don't have to go back that far to understand why people of color do not trust medical systems. And then there's also some things that we don't think about a lot. Law enforcement. There are studies that show that although you talk about defunding the police or addressing police reform, that is also linked to healthcare use and vaccinations. Well, what do I mean by that? People that lived in neighborhoods where they had negative encounters with the police were more mistrustful of medical institutions. So even when it had nothing to do with the medical institution itself, when you live in places where you have negative relationships with law enforcement, that increases medical mistrust. So this whole concept of reproductive justice that seeks to understand how these structural issues, how power and socioeconomic status and racial stratification impact reproductive access to care and health and well-being have direct implications for the things that the secular community cares about. And then let's talk about where you live, where you work, where you eat. This is a picture of W.B. Du Bois, and you're like, well, why are you bringing up a picture of W.B. Du Bois? W.B. Du Bois's work was really focused on trying to address scientific racism. which sounds familiar, given all that is going on today and the desire to revive biological and genetic explanations for health disparities. But he fundamentally understood in his work that it wasn't who people were, it's where they lived. For example, he worked on trying to understand where people live and how that affected their health. Again, a very core tenet of reproductive justice is shaping the environments where people live so that they can work and play in safe conditions and raise their children in safe conditions. Here you can see in his study of Black Americans that when he looked at the quality of the neighborhood or the poverty in the neighborhood, the highest mortality rates were among people living in the slums, and the lowest mortality rates were people living in better neighborhoods. So again, this idea of where we live, where we work, where we play, where we get medical care, all reproductive justice is concerned with that, and it is linked to our health outcomes. It is linked to vaccine use. It is linked to our embrace of alternative medicine. And it is also linked to our schools. So let's talk about this a little bit. Racial discrimination. So racial discrimination can manifest on a number of different levels. It can go on the structural level for our public policies, our laws, our norms, institutions like healthcare institutions, for example, and our one-on-one interactions. We tend to focus on this part, but as we know, racism is bigger than that. And I have receipts because I like a receipt. And reproductive justice, the demand from these Black women was protection from discrimination, right? And they talked importantly about how that if we have healthcare reform, we need to make sure that people are not being discriminated against. And this is not just racial discrimination, it's against ableism, homophobia, xenophobia. All of those isms matter in terms of people getting the quality of care that they need. Here we can see one of the big issues in terms of structural racism is segregation. So you can see here, Milwaukee, which is not too far from where I live. They have their schools are the most hyper segregated in the nation. And why do we care about segregation and redlining? These are things that, again, were shaped by public policy, right? And that they are linked to poor health outcomes. They're linked to time to conception among Black users of an app. They're linked to infant mortality. They're linked to preterm birth. All of those things matter, right? We have the evidence. This is not just us saying, oh, well, we think these things are related. We know that they are related. Redlining in particular is important because it shows that poverty and segregation weren't just accidents. They're creations of the federal government. So where are my receipts? You don't have to believe me, right? It's because we know that the federal government created housing discrimination. So basically the federal government and the homeowners loan corporations disproportionately provided federally backed loans to individuals living in white metropolitan areas. So those were designated the most desirable areas or the best areas, and more Black neighborhoods were deemed the riskiest neighborhoods. And so contemporary scholars have linked these to institutional discrimination. And even though the federal government barred housing discrimination, we still see discrimination in home loans. We still see discrimination in terms of where people are shuffled off into neighborhoods. And the reproductive justice movement has always articulated the ways in which this affects our health and well-being. And lastly, we got to talk about wealth, right? The reproductive justice movement fundamentally understands that access to resources matter. And we can't talk about how we see these disparities in reproductive health and well-being with talking about wealth. Black wealth is 1/10 of that of white wealth. And you might say, well, they need to save some money. Well, some people estimate that Black people would literally have to save all of their income for a year or two to catch up to median white wealth. So this is not a behavioral problem. This is an issue that flows from segregation, that flows from redlining, that flows from discrimination. And all of these things, again, link back to the issues that we claim to care about in the secular community. And here is finally, talking about discrimination in care. An important element of individual discrimination is stereotyping in care. This is some work that I've done with a resident, Dr. John Pullman at UW. And we show that Black women experience more pain post-childbirth, post-C-section, but they don't get any more medication. And even when we control for pain, they actually get less medication compared to white people. And this is very consistent with the literature on racial stereotyping in care. If somebody asks you, well, what evidence do we have about discrimination in care? You can tell them that social psychology experiments show that when medical trainees had false stereotypes about Black people, they were less likely to be able to accurately diagnose their pain or treat them correctly. So again, thinking about all of these things matters. But I don't want to leave you with a lack of solutions. I don't want to leave you thinking, well, what in the heck do we do about all of these things? So I'll give you a few ideas that we can talk about in the Q&A. So how do we make these changes? One is segregation. And we talked a lot in this country about how we fix these problems, but what the federal government wrote, they need to have a primary role in fixing. So there have been a lot of studies of universal basic income pilots coming up that show improvements in people's health and well-being. And I think that universal basic income is a critical one to addressing reproductive justice, making sure people have access to proper housing, making sure that these schools, these unequal schools created by segregation are invested in so that we have more equity across these environments. And then addressing, well, why do you say, well, will segregation matter? Well, the evidence does suggest that when we address these things from a public policy perspective, we see improvements. So here's a picture of a mom and a daughter after the Brown v. Board decision, declaring the statute of separate but equal to be unconstitutional. And what we saw is that decision actually improved educational outcomes among Black women and improved rates of preterm birth. When we think about healthcare as a secular movement, the things that we should be advocating for are evidence-based changes in clinical protocols. So the protocols that say that because I'm a Black woman, I'm less likely to have a successful vaginal birth after C-section, or I'm likely to be disadvantaged when it comes to measuring my kidney filtration. Those things need to be eliminated. Those things need to be addressed in care for us to make sure that we can advance reproductive justice and justice for Americans in general. And then I've done some work thinking about how we address bias in health equity. And I've talked about some of this racial stereotyping and things in schools. And specifically, when we think about why parents put their children in charter schools, it's because they experience discrimination in other schools. It doesn't mean that charter schools are a good solution, but we have to consider how that discrimination, how disproportionately punishing Black children, how downgrading their intelligence, downgrading their grades influences people's desire to go to these charter schools. And then prejudice. I think there's been a lot of talk about implicit bias, which I'm not particularly in training. I don't think the evidence supports implicit bias training, but I do think making structural changes to address racism and racial discrimination, a key element of the reproductive justice movement, must be integrated into secular spaces. We, of all people, have a role to play in leading this conversation about evidence-based ways to reduce discrimination and racism in our spaces, our healthcare spaces and other spaces. And here's another example of things that we can do. The Black Maternal Omnibus, in terms of advancing reproductive justice, addresses many of the social determinants of health that I've been talking about, and it has been supported by many organizations, right? But I have not seen a lot of secular organizations sign on to this set of bills. This is a key place where we can play a role, a leadership role, in advancing evidence-based policies to improve health. And then finally, I have to say, we got to let women of color lead. And what do I mean by that? We need to make investments in organizations like Black non-believers and Latinx-led organizations, et cetera, because frankly, we understand what our community needs. It's not just, vaccines and myth bunking. This is about making sure that people of color have the supports that they need to not rely on religious spaces. And that means investments in our organizations and trusting that we know what to do with that money. And it's not just investing in Black non-believers and other similar organizations, it's making sure that we are at the head of prominent secular organizations like American Atheists, right? To make sure that our perspectives and our viewpoints are allowed to survive and thrive in these spaces. Because orienting our policies around the most vulnerable will make us all better off. And with that, I invite you to commit to making sure that we invest in Black leaders, that we invest in evidence-based policies to make sure that we advance the cause of reproductive justice that was begun by Black women and other women of color so many years ago. Thank you so much.
We have 15 minutes for questions. That includes folks at home. And if you are here, there's a clipboard going around to put your questions on. So we have 15 minutes of questioning happening now. I really love to let women of color lead. I'm also a big believer in letting women of color with disabilities lead. Dr. Tiffany Green, the question that I have is, it shouldn't be a new kind of thing, a new kind of conversation, but do you get a sense that letting women of color with disabilities and in the way that the reproduction justice has been moving, do you get a sense that because of COVID that it is now in a stronger position to be heard, that message to be heard?
So I think I didn't get all of the question, but the sense of the question I got was that is the time right for Black and other disabled women of color to take leadership? Is that essentially the question?
Yes.
So yes, the answer is yes, yes, and more yes. I didn't, in the time that I had, get to talk as much as I wanted to about disability. I'm not disabled at this point in my life, but I have learned so much from the disability community, particularly when it comes to sharpening my analysis of disparities in COVID. I think that had we listened to the disabled activists, we would not have as many COVID deaths. Many of the deaths were in congregate settings. Disabled people have been begging for years to use Medicaid and Medicare funds to get in-home care. And we haven't done that. And that is a big reason why we saw so many deaths. So I think a disability analysis and leadership of people in the disability community is essential. So when I say women of color and non-binary folks of color, I definitely mean disabled folks. And I have learned so much from following them on social media and learning from them about their perspective and how important it is in science. Like, you can't get the science right if you don't let disabled people lead. You can't get social justice right if disabled people are not leading. So yes, I think it's time, and it's been past time. So there was another question I guess I will answer from Anita Peters. There are many women of color in the healthcare field as caregivers. How are they being organized to have a voice in the reproductive justice movement? That's a really good question. I don't know of specific efforts to organize healthcare workers in terms of the reproductive justice movement, but I can say, Black and brown women, and particularly immigrant women, are disproportionately likely to be in low-wage healthcare positions, like home healthcare workers and nursing home staff, and they've been disproportionately exposed to COVID without the benefits. So, like federal legislation to help help Americans with COVID, the nursing home industry successfully argued for them not to get sick leave, right? And so this is certainly a reproductive justice issue. And I would love to hear about any efforts that people are making or that are coming out of that community to address reproductive justice in that population.
Thank you. I'm going to take over the Q&A portion for you in the audience. So we have two questions here. The first is, thank you for speaking, Dr. Green. While we hopefully all agree that social economic justice must go hand in hand, how do we find balance in advocating for the two?
I think so, Mandisa, were you asking how we find balance in our advocacy?
Yes.
So, I don't know the answer to that question. We tired, I think personally, I'm exhausted. The lines between the professional and personal have blurred, especially since the beginning of the pandemic. On one hand, I think women of color need to lead. Other times we need a rest. We need accomplices to take over sometimes and give us a rest. And I don't know the answer. I wish I did. Finding that personal and professional balance. But I know that I get energy from being around like-minded people, women of color, and that, I'm passing the baton so that when one of us gets tired, another one takes over like a relay race and passing it back and forth. We can't be on all the time. That's what I've had to tell myself. Or we will burn out and not be good to anybody, and most especially ourselves. We matter.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Tiffany. So there's a second question regarding pain treatment. Are there any examples of misuse, and also are there any blatant examples of this notion that Black people and other people of color are different in some way, that we experience pain differently in some way?
So I didn't fully hear the question. Are you talking about medical algorithms?
So the question is, are there any pointed examples or what would be some of the excuses that were used over the years to justify that Black folks in particular and other people of color experienced pain differently than white folks?
Sure. Okay. That makes sense. So I'm happy to link the experiment to you. I think I read a lot of the social psychology literature. So in the particular experiment that I talked about, medical trainees that believe things like Black people have heavier bones or are more muscular or things like that, those were used to they were used in ways to stereotype. In terms of the vaginal birth after C-section calculator, when the studies were done in populations to try to understand what predicted a successful vaginal birth after initial C-section, there were things like marriage that mattered, that predicted a successful trial of labor. But none of those went into the VBAC calculator. It was either you're Black or Hispanic. And I don't know what Black Latinas do, because you're either, you could either be Black or Hispanic. And those things were used to stereotype Black women. I have my I'm trying to think about how to put this. I think that the ways that Black women are portrayed as strong, as workhorses, as not feminine, all those things, all those stereotypes come into play when it comes to medical care.
Thank you. Another question that most people don't think in terms of reproductive health is the idea or the experience of women of color in particular who go missing, and the murdered and missing Indigenous women and the murdered and missing other women of color, Black women specifically. And if you could, Dr. Green, could you speak about how this plays into reproductive rights?
Sure. So with Indigenous women, and I didn't get to talk about all the things that I wanted to talk about, Indigenous women have some of the highest rates of sexual assault compared to all other groups. And a lot of the sexual assault is coming from outside of the community, which is another unique aspect of that. So the issue is that the US government has promised Indigenous folks proper health care in treaties, but the Indian Health Service is underfunded. It is terribly underfunded, and they often don't have proper providers to give abortion care and other reproductive health care. And then on top of that, we have the Hyde Amendment, which says that only under really extreme circumstances can Medicaid or the Indian Health Service provide coverage for abortions. So that, the rates of sexual assault and the way that a lot of Indigenous women healthcare is tied into federal government care is a problem. It is a very direct problem with reproductive justice. So I think that's a big one. In terms of missing Black and Brown women, I think that's also an issue because, again, what are the things, predators often play on who's not going to be missing, who is nobody going to care about. And often those are poor women, women who are sex workers, women who don't have people that are looking out for them. And so because of structural inequality, because of structural racism, they are more likely to be poor and or Black or brown women. And I just want to be very clear, I am not judging sex work in any way, shape, or form. But I'm just saying that those are some of the things that that make women of color more vulnerable to assault and worse.
Your social media, there's questions about how we can follow you.
Oh yes, you can follow me if you want some spicy social media stuff. I don't just talk about serious stuff all the time on my social media, but you can follow me at Tiffany_L_Green in terms of my Twitter handle.
Fantastic.
There was one more question. I don't know if we have time to answer it or not. So Kristen, how can we be vigilant not to engage in biological determinism and emphasize that many of the disparate outcomes we see in poor and working class populations, which are disproportionately BIPOC, are due to structural inequality, since biological determinism has used historically to support racist medical practices. I think we need to have conversations with our own. I'm not going to say names because I don't want the dude bros descending upon my social media accounts. But the way that we talk about these things in the secular community is really not scientific at all. So I think we fight back with receipts. We fight back and look at the evidence. Here is what the evidence says about the relationships between segregation and birth outcomes. Here's what the evidence says about discrimination in mortgage lending and economic outcomes, right? We can fight back with one evidence. And I don't think we fight back with education. We fight back with evidence-based strategies to teach our children critical thinking and teach adults critical thinking as well, so that they don't fall into these traps of trying to do an easy relationship between genetics and biology and ignore the role that policy has played in creating these disparate outcomes. So I think the truth matters, and being conversant with the truth matters. Thank you for having me.